The Civil War wasn't fought by one nation against another. It was waged, won, and lost by America's small towns. This is the story of a northern town and a southern town, Brookville, Pennsylvania, and Falmouth, Virginia, and their valiant sacrifices of human toil and treasure, not only on the many horrific battlefields, but also on the long-suffering home fronts of the bitter conflict that decided the fate of our nation. The history of America, in many respects, is the history of our small towns. This is dramatically true of Brookville and Falmouth. Their trials, tribulations, and triumphs stand as a monument to the spirit and vitality of many, many towns all across our land during the titanic struggle that shaped our future. Kenneth Burkett is the executive director of the Jefferson County History Center in Brookville, Pennsylvania. His mission is to engage people of all ages in an understanding of the past and its relevance to the 21st century.
At the time of the Civil War, Brookville was a thriving hub for many of the smaller local communities in the area. Many of the people would farm during the summer, and as soon as the winter set in and the crops were in, they would start working for the lumber industry, cutting trees, getting everything prepared for what we called the spring run. As the Red Bank would get the high waters of the snow melt, they would run the rafts to Pittsburgh and sell those logs. When the water ran high in the spring, even church would shut down because the preacher was helping run the rafts to Pittsburgh.
Dr. William J. McKnight, a 19th century Brookville historian, recalled life in Brookville at the time of the Civil War. He wrote,
"Brookville was a shanty town with a few businesses. No dwelling was complete without having in the backyard an out oven, an ash hopper, a dye kettle, and a rough box fastened to the second story of the necessary in which to raise early cabbage plants."
Well, most of the women would be tending garden plots, certainly doing things like we take for granted today. Laundry would have been an all-day chore, heating the water, hand scrubbing the clothes, drying them, folding them, putting them away, and families were not small back then. You know, it was not unusual to have 9 children in the family.
Women would nearly break their backs lifting these heavy kettles on and off, burn their faces, smoke their eyes, singe their hair, blister their hands, and scorch their clothes. About every family had a cow, dog, cat, pig, geese, and chickens. Of course, the town was alive with fleas, and every house was full of bedbugs.
When the war broke out, America was still agrarian, composed of thousands of small towns like Brookville and Falmouth, and very few large cities. Even places considered to be major population centers, such as Atlanta, Georgia, had populations under 20,000. Randon Bartley joined Berdan's Sharpshooters in 1989, and he continues to participate in living history events sponsored by the U.S. Park Service.
When you look at a map of most counties in the nation at that time, you'll find small communities about 8 to 10 miles apart because that was the average range of travel either on foot or by horse. So you'll have all these very small communities, most of them vanished by now, but that was primarily the extent of your travel. Most people didn't even have a horse, so going to Pittsburgh was quite an event for the people in our area. For most of the volunteers, their first taste of a city of any size would have been Harrisburg, because they were shipped to Harrisburg by rail and then down to Washington, where they had a real eye-opener of what metropolitan life was really like. And the letters they wrote home sustained that view that this was just, for some of them it was Sodom and Gomorrah, and some of them it was paradise.
Around 2,400 men from the Brookville and Jefferson County area enlisted in the Union Army, and many did not return. Roughly 39% of eligible males between the ages of 17 and 40 actually served. Even before the war, Brookville played a prominent role in the budding conflict because it was a vital stop on the Underground Railroad, the escape route for runaway slaves. Falmouth, Virginia was vitally strategic to both North and South because it was only about 60 miles from Washington, D.C. Therefore, during much of the Long War, Falmouth was occupied by thousands of Union troops. The townspeople felt like they were being held against their will by foreign invaders. At the same time, the Union occupation made it possible for thousands of slaves to gain their freedom, even before the Emancipation Proclamation took place. D.P. Newton owns and operates the White Oak Civil War Museum and Research Center in Falmouth, Virginia. Most of the displays were unearthed by D.P. and his father because of their lifelong commitment to preserving their heritage.
When I was small, everybody talked about the Civil War. Just handed down stories and hearing older people talk, like Daddy's, my great-grandmama, she grows right fond of a Union soldier, and I think they were talking about getting married, but she never heard nothing of him no more. Well, during that time, he had made a little jewelry box, and within this jewelry box, it had his name and regiment and stuff. Her great-grandson took the name, and they went to the National Cemetery in Fredericksburg, and he's buried at the National Cemetery in Fredericksburg. So that's what happened to him. He never come back, because either he had died in one of these camps of the disease, or he was killed at Fredericksburg or died of wounds after Fredericksburg.
And D.P. and his father not only conserved the artifacts they found, but they also meticulously recorded where they found them. That work is unimaginable. If you were paying to have that done archaeologically, it would be in the millions and millions of dollars.
There are dozens and dozens of families who trace their lineage back to a Civil War veteran. Many of them still have artifacts from those people. We just had a family reunion for the DeMott family, and they had a canteen that the man carried that he'd written his name on, and his grandson bore the same name.
Norman Schools has been an avid chronicler of Virginia's history for over 40 years. He and his wife Lynetta live in Falmouth, in the former home of Moncure Conway, a Southern aristocrat who became one of the South's leading abolitionists.
Along with my great interest in the Civil War was what my ancestors did. Did they fight for the Confederacy or for the Union, or they didn't fight at all, or what units, what battles? Much later, as I progressed in my journey as a historian and I learned research skills and where to go to find information, I was able to find out more about my ancestors that did fight for the Confederacy. I'm sure that they didn't think at the time that they were probably fighting to preserve slavery. They were probably under the impression that they were fighting Northern aggression and protecting their country, which was the Confederate States of America.
As President Lincoln said after the Battle of Gettysburg, what was at stake was the enormous issue of whether or not a government conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal could long survive. This nation had been brought to life only 87 years ago. There were still men living whose grandparents had shed their blood in the American Revolution, and now they were being called upon to do the same. Their desperate hope was that all this blood should not have been shed in vain. They fervently hoped that our democracy would live on as a beacon of freedom for the whole world. It's sometimes argued whether the Civil War was fought to save the Union or to end slavery. But the truth is that both causes, both points of view, were inextricably intertwined. The North, not just the South, made enormous profits from the slave trade and its tremendous impact on their economies. New York financial institutions were heavily invested in slavery. Businessmen and industrialists were complicit with merchants or shippers who dealt in or depended on human cargo. Investments in slaving voyages came from citizens in every walk of life, even common laborers or shopkeepers. Almost nobody's hands were perfectly clean when it came to this pervasive practice of human trafficking.
Slaves are not unknown in Brookville. In the 1830s, we actually had 2 slaves recorded in the county tax records. One was owned by a gentleman that ran a grist mill, and the mill and the slave were both valued at the same amount of $1,000. And there was also a youngster that was owned by one of the hotel owners in town that assisted in the hotel.
One of the well-known black residents of the town was Charles Sunderland, who was aged when his master brought him to the county, but he always talked about how he held George Washington's horse at the laying of the cornerstone of the Capitol. Whether it was true or not, nobody ever knew. It's curious, one of the first settlers in the county was a black man named Fudge Van Camp. He came in here with the first party of about 4 men, and they all darn near froze to death. But Fudge is the one who tramped out to bring back help to them.
A Negro then had no rights. Anybody had the right to abuse, beat, stone, and mistreat them. I've seen a white bully deliberately step in front of a Negro in a public street and knock him down without a word or look from the Negro. And all this for no crime save they were black.
The injustice of slavery led to the creation of the Underground Railroad. The Freedom Trail crossed the Rappahannock River near Falmouth, and one branch led through Brookville. Gary Smith is a historian and history teacher at the Penn State University campus in Du Bois, Pennsylvania. He's a noted expert on the Underground Railroad.
The Underground Railroad was not an actual railroad as we know it today, with cars and tracks. It was a movement that moves slaves from the south to the north using railroad terms such as stations, station masters, conductors. The name came out of the southeast part of Pennsylvania, down around Philadelphia, where some slaves were being chased, disappeared underground from view. Slave catcher did not know where they went. He coined the phrase. He said they must have disappeared into some type of underground railroad. The underground movement, moving slaves, was necessary because the public as a whole did not look favorably upon anyone interfering with the law and helping slaves to escape. Even the local newspapers here in Brookville ran an article that said that you were beyond the pale of the law, that if you were lynched, stoned, basically in today's phraseology, we'd say you got what you deserved. So therefore you had to go underground.
The early newspapers talk about gangs of escaped slaves coming through Brookville. Now obviously, they didn't come through Brookville on their own. They were guided through Brookville, which means that we had an active underground railroad.
The fugitive slaves coming through western Pennsylvania would be coming out of the Baltimore area or just to the west up through Virginia. Average travel was about 8 or 10 miles per day, and they would have been probably, you know, we think about the Underground Railroad stations a lot of times tied with the communities, but in a rural area, it would have been difficult to move black people in and out of a town, primarily of white people. So I think that in the most case, they were kept on the farmsteads, fed and moved at night onto the next station. Judge Elijah Heath is our best known abolitionist. Judge Heath was ultimately tried and convicted in 1836 of aiding and abetting slaves in federal court in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was fined $2,000. Back then, $1,000 would be an equivalent of $28,000 or $30,000 today. So he paid dearly for his assistance, at least with those 2 people.
Anthony Burns is one of my favorite people because growing up in Southern society, the religion of the day taught that if you were a good Christian, you would also be a good slave. And so he had this torment going on inside of his soul. I want to please God, but I want to be free at the same time. Finally, he came to the conclusion in his life that God never meant for him to be a slave. And he was able to get on a boat and go to Boston. Well, he was apprehended under the fugitive slave law. Well, it ensued and turned into a riot. There was one person killed, a number of people injured. The state of Massachusetts had to call out the militia, the cavalry, the Marines to try to get Anthony Burns back on the boat and sent back down to Virginia.
Going back to 1850, you see a terminal event, the Compromise Act of 1850, with the passage of the Fugitive Slave Law. That was odious. Most Northerners now felt that they had become slave catchers. The only problem was when slave catchers came north, a lot of them didn't care whether you were free or escaped slave. They could take you back south and get $500,000, sometimes even $2,000, which was a lot of money that day for a black slave. That led to the breeding of slaves. You would see handbills announcing the sale of slaves right along with horses. They would breed them, and therefore their children were worth thousands of dollars. But one of the things that the North hated was that 3/5 compromise. They hated that by the 1850s. The fact that the South had a political advantage based on the idea that blacks were property, but they also counted towards voting.
There were abolitionists in the South as well as the North. Norman Schools tells how Moncure Conway experienced a crisis of conscience due to his familiarity with the plight of Anthony Burns and the riots that broke out in Boston.
Well, it just so happened while all of this is going on that Moncure Conway is in Boston, and he's attending Harvard Divinity School. And as he grew up in Falmouth, he realized that the institution of slavery was wrong. And he was forming in his mind abolitionist feelings and thoughts. But when Anthony Burns was apprehended and what the city went through and actually returning him back to slavery and knowing Anthony Burns was the turning point in Moncure Conway's mind where he said, I have to speak out. From this point on, I am an abolitionist.
There were also Northerners who actually went into the South at great risk to themselves. You could be jailed, you could be hung. Many of them were beaten to death, but they still kept going.
Falmouth was in a kind of unique situation because Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy. Washington was the center of the federal government, and you got Falmouth almost halfway in between. So Falmouth naturally is going to, at some point in the war, is going to become some strategic area. Some military operations are going to spring forth from Falmouth in some way. And the people in Falmouth know this is eventually coming. It's in some form or another, this dark war cloud is going to descend upon their town.
In the decade prior to the onset of war, regional animosity built to a frenzy. The anti-slavery North and the slave-holding South each viewed the other as different, inferior, and dangerous. They were like two nations engaged in a Cold War instead of members of the same nation under the same flag. Yet both sections were proud of their common heritage, the courage of the Founding Fathers, the aspirations emblazoned in the Declaration of Independence, and the victory over England that produced the world's first constitutional democracy. But as passionately as the Northern forces believed in national unity, the Southern troops believed in states' rights. Senator John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, a staunch defender of the Southern way of life, even advocated an amendment to the Constitution, allowing for two presidents, one from the North and one from the South, each with the power to veto acts of Congress.
The Moncure Conway House has been designated by the National Park Service as an Underground Railroad Network to Freedom historical site. Now, when most people think about the Underground Railroad, they're thinking about safe houses with secret hiding places and tunnels, usually in houses up north. What's interesting about the South is that the South didn't necessarily have secret hiding places with tunnels, but there were places where African Americans escaped from. This is where they did their servitude, but also where they formulated those ideas of wanting to be free.
You had a certain element in locally who were perfectly willing to see the South leave the Union. They didn't think it was worth the effort. And you had others, some of them abolitionists, who were determined to keep the South in the Union by force. The editor of the Jeffersonian Democrat at that time, Evans R. Brady, who was from Ireland, correctly saw this as a national crisis. And when the war broke out, he and the entire staff of the Jeffersonian Democrat put down their pens and picked up their muskets and went to war. There were Southern sympathizers. The newspapers talk of one man who made the mistake of speaking out against President Lincoln, and he was ridden out of town on a rail.
As the war heated up, local passions became more inflamed. John Scott, writing in the Brookville Republican newspaper on April 18, 1861, exclaimed heatedly,
"Can it be possible to have secessionists in our midst? We have to acknowledge that there are some of those advocates and sympathizers of rebellion in our midst in whose breasts there is the blackest treason. We have more regard for a Southern rebel than a Northern traitor."
Even more intense passions were expressed in this letter of March 11, 1863, from a Union sympathizer to a supporter of the Confederacy. "Dear William, you blockhead, you ass or child of the devil, you contemptible secessionist. This rebellion can and will be put down, notwithstanding all your secessionist talk in the North. You ought to blush to expose yourself in such terms. Be careful of what you do if ever the soldiers come home."
And when you came down to the actual flame that touched off the war, in the North, it was an act of rebellion. They always called it the War of the Rebellion. And in the South, it was the attitude that you're not going to come down here and tell us what to do. And the Southerners always asked Union soldiers after they were captured, "Why are you here?"
Even today, it's hard to imagine how powerful regional passions were able to overcome the need for compromise and statesmanship, thus igniting the bloodiest war in our history, pitting American against American, American town against American town. Yet such is the outcome mirrored by our two chosen examples, Brookville and Falmouth.
This has always been amazing to me. You have a small town in northwest Pennsylvania without a telegraph, but yet the newspapers were printing national events about 3 days after they occurred. For instance, John Brown's raid was front page news for several weeks locally, to the point where John Scott, the editor of the Republican, was poking fun at the people in Virginia and saying, parodying them and say, "John Brown's marching here, John Brown's marching there," you know, because they were so afraid of a slave revolt in the South. At the same time, they were very aware of what was being said in places like Charleston and in Washington, and they were preparing for the storm. You had a lawyer in Brookville, Amory McKnight, raise a militia company under the state militia law at that time, the Brookville Rifles, and they were fully equipped and ready to go. So when the Confederates fired on Fort Sumter, it was the very next day that McKnight offered his company to service for the state of Pennsylvania. It was the firing on Fort Sumter that inflamed the people of the North.
Town Against Town, to me, represents the people that were involved directly in the conflict. Civil War regiments at that time were locally developed. In other words, from Brookville, the 105th Regiment consisted of 1,000 men when they mustered into service. And unlike the military today, those 1,000 men were all from that community. They were cousins, they were brothers, they were high school friends, and they literally would know each other. The downfall of that type of a unit is when they are in a severe struggle or a severe conflict in battle. When those losses accumulate, it directly impacts the town in a very big way.
All too often we lose the personal tragedy of the Civil War in the broader context. When you take away the leaders and take it down to the people who actually fought the war, you find those are the people living in the small towns north and south.
A young man from Brookville, Samuel A. Craig, kept a vivid diary from the time of his enlistment to the end of the war. He speaks eloquently of his decision to join the 105th Pennsylvania Volunteer Infantry.
I was at home in Brookville during the spring vacation from Jefferson College in April 1861. Fort Sumter had fallen, and President Lincoln's call for 75,000 three-month men had been issued. I was in the garden, under the apple tree, hearing the shrill call of the fife and the rub-a-dub-dub of the drums of the recruiting parties down on Main Street, a block away. I, as a young man at the time of a war for the life of the country, and not in it, was unthinkable. What would I think of myself if I stayed at home or even at school during a war for the dissolution of our country?
Sam's an interesting person. He talks about being in Washington, D.C. and getting to see Lincoln and Stanton as they're going towards the White House. And he ends up being with Lincoln on his final journey. He actually stood guard over Lincoln's casket in Washington, D.C. at the funeral. He idolizes President Lincoln. He thinks his views are idealistic. In reverse, William Watson, who's a surgeon with the 105th, and in a letter he writes home, after the emancipation, he is very adamant that with the emancipation he knows that Lincoln's going to create black regiments or more black regiments and put them into the lines. And he writes a letter home that says, if Lincoln puts a black regiment next to the 105th, we'll charge them instead of the Confederates. So there's certainly different viewpoints even among the troops.
As Norman Schools pointed out, the war was so long and so devastating to the South that many people didn't want to talk about it at all for a long time after it was over. D.P. Newton had a hard time learning much about his own relative, William B. Newton, who served with the Confederate Army.
We knew very little about his military, what he did during the war. Daddy knew that he was in the Civil War, but he didn't know his regiment or anything like that. And you must understand that these people never talked about the war. It's like that today. A lot of soldiers don't talk about what they did, especially if they're in combat situations. And it was the same then. My aunt asked my great uncle, George Newton, about the Civil War, and he run away. He said, kids know too much now.
When the Union Army came into Falmouth on the 18th of April, 1862, the wealthy people, the white people, the old established family that had the wealth of Falmouth fled. And one of the fascinating stories that I read that Mike Conway related was that when the Union Army first came into Falmouth, they found the homes of the white populace deserted, but they found the African American populace in their cabins, in the little kitchens and places where they had their servitude and their quarters, and they were on their knees praying, thanking God that the Union Army had come. Some of the freedom seekers stayed with the Union Army and found employment with the Union Army. They did some of the same things that they had done for their white masters, such as being cooks, taking care of horses, labor-type jobs. But some of them also found an opportunity to actually serve their country and the cause of anti-slavery and freeing the slaves by serving as scouts and spies. Prior to the Civil War, one of the laws that was in the South was African Americans could not own guns or use guns. But the Civil War gave them an opportunity to be soldiers just like whites were, to have guns, uniforms, and be equipped where they could contribute to their country and fight for the freedom of their brothers and sisters.
By the actions of two brothers, the NT brothers, these were free black men who, as soon as possible, joined the United States colored troops, and both of them gave their lives in the service of the country.
Approximately 175 regiments, composed of more than 178,000 free blacks and freemen, served during the last 2 years of the war. By war's end, the United States colored troops made up nearly 1/10 of all Union troops. They suffered 2,751 combat casualties during the war and 68,178 losses from all causes, including disease. They suffered extra violence at the hands of the Confederate soldiers. They were victims of battlefield massacres and atrocities and were at risk for murder by Confederate soldiers rather than being held as prisoners of war.
A lot of people wanted to prove that they were actually men because they were treated like animals for so long. So they wanted to prove that they were as valuable as any other men. They wanted to prove that they can fight. They wanted to prove that they can actually free their own families. Also, since they were slaves, they hadn't earned money, so now they're going to earn money for being soldiers in the Civil War. Now, you also are going to have 18 Medal of Honor winners who are going to be black soldiers. A lot of them were going to be non-commissioned officers like sergeants and corporals. But at the Battle of New Market Heights, 14 black soldiers earned the Medal of Honor in that one battle.
There was the hazard, of course, that the Confederate government had stipulated that a white officer captured commanding black troops would be put to death. So this certainly was something that was always going to be in the back of the mind of these men. It was a rather barbarous sort of declaration that the Confederate government made. They were horribly insulted that the Union Army was going to actually pit black soldiers against their men.
And it's very fascinating, some of the stories, and one of them that I particularly like was called the clothesline telegraph. And there was a certain individual named Dabney who came into the Union lines, but his wife stayed over on the Confederate side of the Rappahannock River, which was Fredericksburg, right across from Falmouth. And she was privy to some of the meetings. She was a servant of the wife of one of the Confederate officers, and so she could pick up information. And what she did was developed a clothesline telegraph where she would go out and hang clothes in a certain way, certain patterns, certain colors that related to troop movements. And her husband on the Falmouth side of the river could interpret that, and then he could go to the Union authorities and say, hey, I know where the Confederates are going tomorrow. It's fascinating that they could come up with something like this and be so accurate in the information, but you can be so much caught up in that story that what you don't think is that if his wife had been caught, what would have happened to her. And so it truly is a remarkable story, and it tells about their courage and also how they wanted to serve their country also.
The Falmouth and Fredericksburg area suffered horribly during the war, not just from the battles and the overwhelming casualties, but also from the foraging of the Union Army, chopping down all the trees for their campfires and fortifications, and ravaging the countryside, destroying the fields and the crops, and turning the soil to dust. Mary Diedrich of Augusta County, Virginia, wrote the following on February 1st, 1862.
Dear Henry, times is hard here, and if this war continues, I don't know what poor people is to do. You wanted to know if I had any corn. I have got some, and I have to feed my hogs every night and every morning a little. Mr. Ellis gave me 25 pounds and 30 pounds of flour a month, 1 pound of coffee, 2 pounds of sugar, and no meat. Everything is so high. You don't know what hard times I have here.
And Nancy Emerson, talking of Yankee depredations, wrote,
How many pleasant homes have these barbarians desolated, strewing the gardens with fragments of glass and china, filling the air with feathers from the beds. How many churches have been polluted, how many graves desecrated, how they have soaked our soil with the blood of our noblest and best, and then to cap the climax of injury and insult, talk of reconstructing the Union.
Probably one of the biggest events that's taken place in this area was the Battle of Fredericksburg that took place in December 1862. Horrific casualties, a huge defeat for the Union Army, and also for those that were supporting the cause of abolition. and wanted to see the slaves free. The 20th Massachusetts lost over 60% casualties in the Battle of Fredericksburg. As a reward for their bravery and their sacrifice, they were given this house to be used as their winter quarters after the battle. Now, Chancellorsville is located about 10 or 15 miles or so west of Fredericksburg. While Hooker was trying to outflank Lee, Stonewall Jackson outflanked Hooker. This resulted in a very devastating battle again with horrific casualties. General Stonewall Jackson was reconnoitering ahead of his troops late in the evening, and he was mistaken by his own troops as the enemy, and they fired upon him, which resulted in him being severely wounded. The death of Stonewall Jackson was devastating to the Confederacy, and some historians believe that the Civil War, as far as the South was concerned, was lost at that point.
Probably more Jefferson County men served in 105th Pennsylvania than any other regiment. And their casualty lists fill up columns in the local papers after major actions, such as the Peninsula, Gettysburg, and so on. And it was truly terrible because these were all people that you knew, your relatives, your schoolmates, certainly somebody who lived no more than 6 miles away. Unfortunately, whenever, say at Chancellorsville, whenever the Union Army did not hold the ground, a lot of times the people who fell, of course, they had no identification discs, and they were unknown.
The women and children, North and South, had the burden of carrying on at home while their men were off fighting. They lived with the overriding fear that at any moment they might learn that their loved one had been badly wounded or killed, or even died of disease. One such letter is this one of August 18, 1862, to Mr. and Mrs. Coulter from Andrew J. Harrell of the 11th Pennsylvania Regiment. I seat myself this evening with a sorrowful heart to write you a few lines. It's a subject which will cause you sorrowful feelings, but it cannot be helped. Your son is dead. I have taken upon myself to have him buried. I have got a coffin for him and intend to have him buried in the burying ground at Falmouth. We have lost as good and faithful soldier as was in our company.
I had a great-great-grandfather that was a private in the 105th Regiment of the Pennsylvania Volunteers, which formed in Brookville, Pennsylvania. And he served from 1862 until July 2nd at Gettysburg, where he was severely wounded. He took a musket ball through his upper jaw, and it came out through the lower jaw. And he survived, fortunately, because we wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be here today if he wasn't.
Samuel Craig, the young soldier who had enlisted in Brookville, fought in many battles in the Falmouth-Fredericksburg area. He was severely wounded by a musket ball that struck in the corner of his right eye, then traveled inside his nose, mouth, and jaw, and down the left side of his neck, coming out finally halfway down his shoulder, close to his jugular vein. Miraculously, he survived, but his folks back home were told otherwise, and he writes about it in his diary. His obituary was printed in the Jeffersonian Democrat, published in Brookville, and he was mourned and regarded as left for dead by the 23rd Regiment.
But there are instances of men just disappearing, the letters stop, the money stops coming home, there's no further word, and we don't know what happened to those people. They were killed, wounded, missing in action, and probably buried in some anonymous grave somewhere on a battlefield.
And these are the graves you find at the National Battlefield cemeteries marked unknown. For instance, at Gettysburg, I believe there are almost 500 Union graves marked unknown. And in that case, the families would never know.
Kate Scott, Brookville historian, documented the role of women during the war years.
The history of Jefferson County is that of every county in the loyal North. The mothers, wives, and sisters, they took the men's places in the stores, offices, and workrooms, and even in the field, plowing, sowing, and reaping, and in all those years of long suspense and hope deferred.
Carol Briggs has written extensively about Kate M. Scott.
Kate was not born in Jefferson County, but moved here in 1855 when her father took a position with the Whig newspaper. When word came from Colonel McKnight, who was down on the Potomac with the 105th, that the soldiers were suffering from pneumonia and fever, Kate took it upon herself that she wanted to go and be of service. Kate, along with 3 other young women, traveled to Camp Jemison, where they spent the next 3 months taking care of the ill. Kate and her fellow nurse, Ellen Guffey, both suffered from smallpox, were quarantined on 2 occasions. And then when the 105th moved out to Fort Monroe, Kate and the 3 other young women came back to Brookville.
Well, a woman with children after a confirmed death or even disability of a husband had to make some decisions, obviously. If they had a farm, they needed to be able to figure out how they were going to maintain that farm. In most cases, they were unable to hire people. There are cases or instances of a nephew coming in from a brother's or sister's family that's old enough to help run the farm for a while.
If you wanted to make a fire, somebody had to go out and cut the wood. If you wanted to have bread on your table, somebody had to plant it, harvest it, and prepare it. So even to draw water meant somebody had to go out to the well, even in January, and draw the water up.
We're recently aware of a lady that had a husband in the 105th Regiment, and she's writing to her sister that she hasn't heard from her husband in 3 months. And this is just after the Battle of Chancellorsville. And she doesn't know whether he's been killed or wounded or captured. And, you know, she's surviving on very little with her children, and literally writes that they're starving, and she's trying to do everything she can to maintain the household, but is in fear that he's not going to come home.
As demanding and heartbreaking as the war was for Northern women, it was even more devastating for the women and children of the South. There was death and destruction everywhere. It was almost universal. And as the Southern economy collapsed and their Confederate currency dwindled to worthlessness, the lives of the women and children were overwhelmed by poverty, despair, and starvation. Nancy Emerson writes of some of the abuses of Northern troops.
At one of our neighbors, they took everything they had to eat, all the pillowcases and sheets, the towels and some ladies' stockings. One of them had a bundle of ladies' clothing to take, but his comrade shamed him out of it. Then they poured out the molasses, scattered their preserves and sugar and other things about the floor. Those who left their houses fared worse than others. At least their houses did. The wife of a worthy miller living near us became so much alarmed that she went with her children to a neighbor's. They stripped her house completely, destroying everything and leaving nothing but a straw bed and 1 sheet.
When the war was nearly over, the North was getting ready to bask in triumph. Even though the Union Army had suffered terrible losses, Northern towns had not been utterly destroyed like the Southern towns were.
Now that the rebellion is virtually at an end, our brave soldiers will soon be discharged and permitted to return to their homes. But our joy at their return will mingle with a feeling of sorrow and regret for those brave ones who will not return again, many of whom are lying low today under the green sod of the Southern battlefield. Their death was glorious, and their lives freely given. We will more sacredly prize the victories which their blood has hallowed, while we cherish and revere their memories.
Asking my dad and my relatives what they could remember, what they could tell me, they could always say, well, we know they were in the war. And that's basically it. And I think it sort of went along with this, I call it a Southern thing, that the war was so devastating and so hard to get over with, that life was so hard, those type of things were just not thought about or important or passed along. It was something you got over with, and it was just behind.
And you certainly had some bitterness. Somebody who'd left a leg on the battlefield at Chancellorsville might be less apt to forgive than somebody who did not serve. And I think it says a lot that there was one Confederate veteran who settled in Brookville, John W. Geither. He was actually from Maryland. It was love. He married a local girl, and he was accepted into the community. And the Grand Army, when John Geither passed away, performed a burial service for him that they would have done for one of their own.
Widows receive, and wounded men receive small pensions from the military after the war. It didn't sometimes take place for a few years after. Certainly would not have been much to help them out. Children were sometimes put in orphanages, and in many cases the women remarried as soon as possible just simply out of need. There wasn't Social Security or any type of other benefiting mechanism back then, so by being remarried is the only way to maintain a household.
Immediately after the war, you had an expansion in all the activities that weren't pursued during the war. For instance, as following World War II, you had a bump in the birth rate because a lot of these fellows had not been home for 3 years. That was one side effect. Another side effect was that you suddenly had a lot of widows and orphans.
Unlike the war in Afghanistan today, where a community may get news of a single individual that's been killed in action, back then, after a major conflict such as Gettysburg, the rolls of killed and wounded would cover columns on a newspaper. And the impact back onto those communities was significant, not only for the numbers of soldiers killed and wounded, but the impact on the families and the economy in the future, and how things would develop after the war. When you lose 20% of the young people in your town in one death day, that's going to have some type of a major impact.
By the end of the war, its toll of human suffering was pitiful, especially in the South. To make matters worse, some Northern politicians wanted to punish the South as a conquered nation, in spite of the obvious paradox that the North had fought the war on the premise that the South could not become a separate nation.
But if you go back to the beginning of the Lincoln administration, and maybe he did go into the Civil War too quickly. If he had, I've always thought to myself, if he had not done that or waited before he did that, would there have been another outcome? That's one way to look at it, almost like from a Southern point of view, as if we're still the victims. Why was this horrific war placed on us?
If President Lincoln had lived, his policy of malice toward none and forgiveness for all, which he expressed in his second inaugural speech, might have stood a chance. But Lincoln was assassinated by the notorious John Wilkes Booth, who believed that somehow his murderous action would aid the South. But instead, it made the Southern situation far worse. Northern leaders assumed that Jefferson Davis and other Confederate leaders had instigated the crime. One newspaper editorial cried out, "It was slavery that conceived the fearful deed. It was slavery that sought and found the willing instrument and sped the fatal ball."
Curiously, when a lot of the veterans came home after their initial 3-year enlistment was over, a lot of them were very upset about the Emancipation Proclamation and became very ardent opponents of President Lincoln. In fact, when Lincoln was assassinated, editor J.P. George of the New Era boldly said, "Don't expect me to mourn for him."
Lincoln's successor, President Andrew Johnson, was vilified for wanting to carry out Lincoln's lenient policy for healing the nation's wounds. Radicals in Congress passed harsh Reconstruction Acts that formed the South into 5 sternly ruled military districts. The fight over harsh policies versus those that were more lenient, and the battles between Congress and the President, led to the impeachment of Andrew Johnson in 1868, which came short of a conviction by only 1 vote.
Winston Churchill once said the American Civil War was the most inevitable war. The issue had to be settled, and it was settled in favor of a strong federal government.
My personal impression at this day and age is that if Lincoln could have delayed the Civil War as he wanted to do, within a generation there would have been no need to have it. We were on the verge of something called the Industrial Revolution. And in just a few years, with mechanized farming equipment and ways of manufacturing things that the slaves were doing in the South, why did you need 100 slaves when you could use a tractor to plow a field? I think it would have been self-eliminating within another generation at least if we could have just stayed out of it.
My answer when somebody asked me about the Civil War was for me to simply ask them what you say when you pledge allegiance to the United States. If you run over in your mind those words, you'll find the root cause and the fruit of the Civil War.
In many ways, our nation is still divided by the same political and cultural issues, the same conflicts that were left not fully resolved by the Civil War and its bitter aftermath. Is the federal government too powerful? Should the individual states have more autonomy, more freedom to govern their own citizens without undue interference or coercion from the President, the Congress, or the Supreme Court? How should we deal with racial injustice or immigration reform? Our daily politics, our state and national elections are still bitterly contested over these persistent and alienating issues. 4 years of bloodshed restored the Union, but did not perfect it. In many ways, the struggle goes on, and it is up to us to ensure that government of the people, by the people, and for the people does not perish from the earth.